How's it going, everybody? On the Road DFS coming at you once again with some fantasy outlooks for this coming season. I just decided I'm going to try to do this alphabetically, so I'm going to go from the numbers here to start things off, even before the A's or the B's or anything like that. We have the Philadelphia 76ers. I did the Cavs last time because that's my favorite team. Just wanted to start off with them. But we're going to go with the Philadelphia 76ers here to get things started in our alphabetics. So I'm just going to go through this. Before I start, if you like this content and it's helping you prepare for your fantasy basketball season, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It goes a long way. I'm looking to grow this channel and eventually have some giveaways. Probably once we reach 100 subs, 150, I'll let you know as we get closer, but really trying to grow this channel. So without further ado, let's have a preview look here at the 2021-2022 Philadelphia 76ers roster from a fantasy outlook. So first up, we have Charles Bassey. I've never heard of him before. My apologies if that's a well-known player, but it looks like he's a rookie. I know he's not their first rounder. I know who their first rounder was, so maybe that's their second rounder or somebody unsigned. Either way, not going to spend too much time. I would assume that he goes undrafted in fantasy drafts and just monitor him, and if he carves out a spot in the rotation, then grab him. We have Gary Clark here, and this is interesting. Gary Clark, he was a little bit of a value at certain points in his Magic days for sure, but Gary Clark now finds himself on the 76ers. This is a guy worth monitoring as the season goes on if he carves out a spot in that rotation. And I mean, the Sixers have some injury concerns basically all around. A lot of their starters have at least somewhat injury concerns. Of course, we know Embiid, but it's worth monitoring some of these bench guys for the Sixers, and Gary Clark definitely falls under that category, as he's a bench guy who could see a big minutes bump if somebody goes down. So if you see a Sixers player getting hurt, maybe monitor Gary Clark, add him to your watch list on the waiver wire. All right, Seth Curry, obviously he's been with the Sixers now. This is his second year with them. He looked nice for some parts of last year. Some parts were a little ugly, but overall I'd say more good than bad with Seth Curry. And I would really look for him to establish himself here in his second season with the Sixers. I mean, keep in mind, his first season with them was last year, and he looked pretty good. He was a serviceable fantasy option. Obviously not one of your top guys, but you need some glue guys on your fantasy roster to really bring it all together. And he had some injury issues, but I mean, anyone could suffer an injury, hypothetically. So there's no reason to stay away from Curry as far as I'm concerned in a later round. I wouldn't reach for him, but you know, he's a solid, like I said, a solid glue guy for your roster. I think Curry would be a solid pick. Interesting one here, Andre Drummond, the new acquisition for the Sixers here in the offseason. And it's an interesting storyline to follow, as Andre Drummond and Joel Embiid have not gotten along at all in the past. That actually might be somewhat of an understatement. Some of you may have seen that awkward hug that they gave that was on social media, but that's a whole nother thing. But from a fantasy perspective, Drummond could be a decent option. It depends how they play him, because, you know, that whole Lakers situation with Drummond was really weird, especially on the back end of it. It wasn't clear what exactly his role was, if he even really had a role. So, you know, just going to have to monitor this. And Drummond, if he can carve out a good bench role, he could be value in a later round. I would not reach on Drummond. Again, some people might see the name Andre Drummond and they might try to take a higher pick with him. Don't do it. At least that's my advice. Don't do it. I think Drummond's best days are behind him. I don't know what his role is going to be, but we know it will be a bench role. Next up is Joel Embiid, the big man himself. And you know what Embiid brings to the table at this point. Outstanding fantasy player, maybe one of the top guys when healthy, but that's the risk that you're going to have to take if you use an upper pick on Joel Embiid. You just have to realize this guy, I mean, he gets injured every year. He's going to miss some games. If nothing else, even if he's healthy the whole rest of the season, if The Sixers have a playoff spot, on ice, completely locked up. He might rest. He's an obvious rest candidate. Even if he's healthy the whole year leading up to that, there is no reason that the Sixers would risk him suffering a potentially bad injury, knowing him playing in meaningless games towards the end of the season. So just keep in mind, if nothing else, if he doesn't get injured the whole rest of the year, which is not anywhere near a guarantee, he definitely could rest towards the end, maybe in your fantasy playoffs. So just keep that in mind when you're drafting him. I love him still from a fantasy perspective. He's insane. He's a great player. Definitely should be one of the top 10 players drafted. But you just have to keep in mind the injury situation with him, and on top of that, the fact that he is a strong rest candidate towards the end of the year. Next up is Danny Green, and big congratulations to Danny Green for getting married. I believe it was yesterday. I saw the pictures. His old North Carolina teammates came out. Tyler Hansbrough jumped in the swimming pool fully clothed, so it looked like a great time. Congratulations to Mr. and Mrs. Green, but on the fantasy side of Danny Green, I don't really know what to think. I think I like him slightly less than I do Seth Curry. I think Curry's just more consistent, and he does a little bit more outside of scoring. They're both scoring-based players, obviously, but Danny Green, outside of his threes, I think does less for you than Seth Curry does. So I like Curry over Green. I don't hate Green, but it would have to be a late-round pick, and you'd have to view him as your glue guy. I like Curry a little more as that glue guy than I do Green, but it's kind of a toss-up. Green could have, another great year. He's been on a bit of a decline, I would say, overall, but he could reverse that trajectory here this coming year. Tobias Harris for the 76ers, I think is a very strong pick. He's really proven himself, I think, as a extremely underrated player in the NBA, quite honestly. Embiid is the obvious one here off this team, the one that you pick first if you could pick anyone off this roster. But I would argue that Harris is two. You could put Simmons in there. We'll get to him in a minute. It's kind of a toss-up between Harris and Simmons. But I personally like Harris a little more just because the Simmons situation in Philadelphia is a bit unclear. I think Harris has really solidified himself there. Didn't think I'd be saying that coming into last year, but I think Harris is just a very strong pick. I would say you should go in the top end of drafts. I wouldn't use like a first on him or anything like that. Second or third, it depends exactly which pick we're talking here, but I think Harris could be a strong third-round pick for sure. If he's around in the fourth round, definitely. I think Harris is the type of value guy you look for in drafts, and if Harris is still around in the third or fourth round of your fantasy draft, definitely don't be afraid to take a chance on Tobias Harris. I view him as a pretty safe pick, and honestly probably will hit major value for that round. Isaiah Joe, he's a guard originally from Arkansas. Don't know a whole lot about him except that he averaged almost 4 points last year on about 11 minutes. We'll probably go undrafted and just monitor and see if he has a bench role. Here we have Korkmaz, and this one's actually pretty interesting because particularly in the playoff run this last year for the 76ers, Korkmaz actually played a pretty key role in some of those games. Obviously it didn't end the way the Sixers wanted it to, but his minutes were increased, and there were a lot of factors that led into that. But I think the bottom line is Korkmaz did prove himself in the minutes he was given. He's a solid player, and I think this is going to be one of the top guys off the bench for the 76ers. So I have no issue using a late pick on Korkmaz, particularly like your second to last pick, depending how deep your league is. But if you're in a pretty deep league, your second to last pick, maybe your last pick on Korkmaz, absolutely. He could end up having a very solid role on this team off the bench. And I think those are the exact type of players that you use a later pick like that on. Tyrese Maxey is the next guy we're going to look at here. And I'll tell you what, Maxey really impressed me during last year's playoffs. He's another guy in the Sixers who who was given time, given a chance, and he really took advantage of it and proved himself in my eyes. And I think a lot of other people would agree, particularly on this Maxey point. I think he really he showed something to the Sixers. Would not be surprised if he took a big step forward here in this coming year. Maxey is someone you could definitely target in the later rounds and could be a major value. Shake Milton. Now, this guy is heavily affected by the Ben Simmons situation, and you could say the same about Maxey a second ago. But Milton, I think in particular, is going to be very heavily affected by the Ben Simmons situation. I personally would not be shocked if Ben Simmons ended up getting traded. It's funny how much I'm mentioning him considering I haven't even gotten to him yet. But I think that's the big storyline that's going to affect this team pretty heavily, is if Simmons goes, then what's the situation for some of these bench players? Milton has been a pretty comfortable six-man type of guy for the 76ers, but if Simmons leaves, that's going to obviously change. It also matters who the Sixers get in return for Ben Simmons. Will a point guard be part of that package? No way of really saying. But I do expect Simmons to be traded at some point, in my personal opinion, and that definitely would help Milton in terms of his minutes. Here's an interesting one. We have Nyang now on the 76ers, and I would say that was kind of an under-the-radar acquisition there, Nyang to the Sixers. I didn't hear very much about that, and I mean, not everyone would be familiar with Nyang, but anyone that was watching the Jazz last year would know that he played a pretty solid role off the bench for them. Nyang, he got his minutes generally. It was off the bench, as I said, but he usually took advantage and he knocks down his threes pretty well. And honestly, a pretty solid pickup for the 76ers. We did not hear very much about it. I don't know if I would draft him, but this is like one of the type of guys, depending on the size of your league, but in the size of the leagues I'm generally in, this could be one of those guys you want to put on your watch list. I don't think I'd draft him, but put him on your watch list maybe at the very beginning of the year and just sit on it and observe and watch and see exactly what Nyang's up to. And if he starts, consistent bench points, if he starts producing those, add him to your team. I mean, find someone underperforming on your roster, kick him off, add Nyang. I mean, I do like this guy. He's a solid player. Flip Petrusev, I am not too familiar with. He went to Gonzaga, apparently. It looks like he's a rookie. He might have been undrafted or he was their second rounder. Not really sure, but he will go undrafted in fantasy drafts, I would assume. And, I mean, you can watch him if you want, but I would not expect this to be a big fantasy producer here. Paul Reed, again, I don't know this guy too well, but maybe watch him and see. I would not expect him to be one of the big bench producers either. Mike Scott here for the Sixers. Now, Scott every once in a while would have like a decent game for them last year. I think probably I wouldn't draft him. I don't even know if I'd have him on my watch list really, unless you figured out that he really somehow carved out a great bench role, much greater than he did last year, which honestly with the Nyang signing, I don't see it. I would actually assume that his stats will stay about the same or maybe decrease because of that signing. So I'm not huge on the Mike Scott draft, I guess. All right, the moment you've all been waiting for, our guy Ben Simmons. Seems like he's had a lot of storylines about him this offseason and in last year's playoffs. It's going to be interesting. It's kind of like James Harden coming into last fantasy season, and I actually drafted Harden. Okay, the word that was out was that Harden was going to be traded. He was unhappy in Houston. And I thought to myself, okay, so if he's traded, so what? I mean, I think he's going to get his stats just about anywhere. I was partially right. I mean, on the Nets, Harden was still looking great prior to the hamstring injury. But I kind of feel the same way about Simmons. And I know he was horrible in the playoffs and this and that. But generally, he's a decent fantasy producer. And I think whether he's on the Sixers or whether he's traded, that's probably going to stay the same. I think he's going to get his fantasy points no matter which team he's on. And that's that. This actually could be the type of guy who falls further in fantasy drafts than he should based on this perception about him. I mean, who cares if he goes cold in the playoffs if you need him in the regular season? I mean, his regular season stats are generally pretty good. He's helped me win a fantasy championship in the past. So if he's dropping majorly, don't be afraid to take a shot on Ben Simmons. If you look around and you see the other players available are quite frankly nowhere near Simmons' level, then go ahead and take a shot on him. And if he gets traded, he might get traded into a better situation. Who knows? Matisse Thybulle, he was pretty impressive there with Team Australia in the Olympics. He was getting a lot of steals. We know he's a hustle player, really defensive-minded, but he'll hit some shots here and there too. I wouldn't hate like a late-round pick on Thybulle. Quite honestly, I only see his role increasing from here. He's a young player. And I mean, he should be, well oiled and ready here to play another season. He went pretty deep in the playoffs with the Sixers, then went to the Olympics. So the only thing would honestly be, is he fatigued at all from that? But I would guess not, because he's a young player. He should be good to go, and I'm impressed with him, honestly. Korkmaz and Thybulle I view similarly. Next up, we have Jaden Springer. He's the first-round pick. They took him with the 28th pick in the draft. I'd have to watch more highlights of his and see exactly what type of player he is. He's a guard from Tennessee. But honestly, some of these rookies are worth taking a shot on. I kind of feel like Tyrese Maxey plays his position and probably is first in line for more minutes before this rookie is. This seems like more of a developmental type thing with him. Particularly in those later first-round picks. So I wouldn't expect Springer to get a ton of minutes or anything like that. But again, do your own research on someone like Springer, who I did not watch in college. I did not catch too many Tennessee games. So if you know something I don't know about Springer, definitely use a pick on him at some point. We have Anthony Toliver here. He's the veteran. I wouldn't expect too much from him and would not use a pick on Toliver. All right, that's all I have for you today, breaking down the Philadelphia 76ers from a fantasy perspective. If you find this content helpful and it's helping you devise a draft strategy for this coming NBA fantasy season, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really does go a long way. Looking to build this channel and help you guys out. So this is just the Sixers version of this video. I will be doing one for every NBA team, so stay tuned and I'll have another video out for you before you know it.